Welcome to the Special Needs Kids Are People Too podcast with Amy Bodkin, EDS. Amy is an autistic adult who also happens to be a school psychologist turned special needs consultant and public speaker. She's also a homeschooling mom to 2 autistic kiddos, a yoga instructor, a card-carrying Trekkie, and an all-around fun person. And last but not least, Amy is an advocate for seeing every child as a person, not a diagnosis. Because a special needs kid is just like any other child, just more so. Here's Amy Bodkin.
Hi, I'm Amy Bodkin, coming to you from the blanket fort in my home office. And welcome to Special Needs Kids Are People Too. Today, I wanted to touch on something that we talked about briefly in the last podcast. We were discussing ways that we can support children processing trauma, especially in light of this last year with the pandemic. One of the books I recommended was Childhood Disrupted, and it listed several different things partway through the book that could be used to help an adult process childhood trauma. And I mentioned that I had been homebound for my health in 2016. I think what caused it was actually autistic burnout. A lot of autistic adults, especially in young adulthood, we experience autistic burnout. We've been trying too hard to do everything and be like everybody else that we just end up shutting down. Whether our health goes really poorly or we lose the ability to communicate, it's always a sign of stress. And I think some of it's because sometimes we have a hard time learning to listen to our own bodies. Sometimes we can feel kind of disconnected from ourselves, whether it's because we have sensory processing differences, and so maybe we don't quite feel at home in our own body. Sometimes we don't like change, and so hormone changes that lead to physical changes can sometimes be really difficult. Feeling at home in your own skin as the gender you were born, that can be challenging too. So those can all be difficult things, and I think yoga especially was helpful to me. One, because it was accessible. I was homebound, so there weren't a lot of things I had access to, but I could hire a private yoga teacher to come to my house, and she gave me a 20-minute practice I could do on my own a few days a week, and within 5 months I wasn't homebound anymore. But I also think that yoga is helpful to a lot of autistics, which I've heard a lot of other autistic adults talk about this. And I think a lot of it is because not only the disconnectedness we sometimes feel and the anxiety that we have to learn to be able to cope with somehow. Yoga's kind of perfect as a way of learning how to do those things because it starts with movement. And sometimes we're anxious enough, we have a hard time settling down just to listen to our own bodies. And having a movement to move through can sometimes help with that. It's also really helpful, I think, for kids, because kids also have a hard time settling down and listening to themselves. They really like to move a lot. And yoga can be a great way of kind of reaching some of that mindfulness. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about yoga. A lot. So I definitely want to go through and explain some of that probably before we get too much further in, because I know that that can be really confusing to people in the United States. When I finished my private yoga and was no longer homebound, I decided I wanted to learn more. So I signed up for yoga teacher training, and I had the fortune of my lead teacher having been trained in India. So my program was heavily focused on the history and philosophical traditions of yoga. So before we get any further, I'd like to go through and explain some of that and maybe clear up some of the misconceptions that we have. in the United States in particular. People, generally speaking, either think that yoga is all about a fitness program, which it's not. And the other option, people usually assume that yoga is idol or devil worship, and it's not that either. Yoga is a Sanskrit word that means union. And just like we have words in English like nail, where there's fingernail or hammer and a nail, yoga is a word that is used for different things in India. There is a religion called yoga. That is not where the practice of yoga comes from. The religion of yoga did eventually come out of the practice we know as yoga. It came from there, but not immediately or directly. So let's go back and look at the history of yoga, where it came from, and what it actually is. Because I find a lot of Westerners don't know. And that's understandable because there is a huge gap in not only language, but culture. And that makes a big difference. So yoga developed in the Indus River Valley civilization thousands of years ago. Probably about the same time as the ancient Hebrews, around probably the time period of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, all of the Hebrew patriarchs, to give it a Western context. And actually, there's a lot of things we don't know because we really don't have much left from the Indus River Valley civilization. There's not a lot of written records. What there is, we can't read. There are pictures drawn into clay pots, walls, that kind of thing, and they represent yoga poses, so we know that it came from there. But all of the written records we have about yoga came much later, thousands of years later, and yet still at least over 2,000 years from where we are now. But those were written down much later. So it developed much earlier, and there's really such a limited amount we know because there's so much missing from ancient civilization, 5,000 plus years ago. We have bits and pieces, stories that people felt were important to pass down, religious texts. We have those kinds of things, but there's a significant limitation. And the Indus River Valley civilization was abandoned, and we really don't have too much else about it. We only discovered it in recent history. So, we know that's where yoga comes from, but we really don't hear too much more about it for another couple thousand years as far as written language goes. What we do know is that the ancient Hebrews and the ancient yogis did have a relationship. There is evidence of that. And there's also similarities in language. When I was taking yoga teacher training, I recognized quite a few Sanskrit words that were very similar in sound and meaning to Hebrew words. So there's that. Also, there are some stories. They're stories. We can't, prove any of them in any way, shape, or form, but there are stories where people say that Abraham's second wife, Keturah, had sons and that he sent them east. That part is written in the Bible. And then people say that perhaps those sons were the ones who ended up settling the Indus River Valley, and that they may have been the ones who came up with yoga or created it, and that perhaps some of the gifts Abraham had given his sons, since he gave Isaac his religion, maybe he gave them gifts of mindfulness, meditation, things that aren't exactly your religion, but maybe practices, like a practice of prayer. There's some evidence to that. Well, not evidence to that, but there is evidence of a relationship for sure. And meditation has been a part of Judaism for thousands of years as well. And there have been writings, mostly in Hebrew, that were not translated until about 50 years ago or so. There's a great book called Jewish Meditation that kind of details out some of that, where there's a little bit of translation in there of some of the documents. And of course, most people know that Christianity developed right from the bedrock, I guess you could say, of Judaism. And Catholicism has their rosary beads, which is very much a meditative type of prayer. When you look at the development of Hinduism, a lot of that came out of yoga and the Indus River Valley civilization. Yoga itself, though, was a theistic philosophy. Even when it was written about years later by Patanjali, it was a theistic philosophy. And a theistic philosophy is not a religion. It is a philosophy towards life that assumes some form of higher power, but it doesn't tell you who that higher power has to be. And so, being a philosophy, it's rooted in several different ideas. I think probably the most important ideas that yoga is rooted in is the Yamas and the Niyamas. Yamas are translated as restraints, and Niyamas are translated as observances. So basically the things we want less of and the things we want more of. And there's 5 of each, and each of them allows you to be able to sit with yourself, to listen to your body, to listen to your mind. Because when we're participating in the things that we're supposed to avoid, it can be very difficult to sit with ourselves. So I'll go ahead and tell you what those 5 are and how it can be difficult to sit with yourself if you're doing these. So ahimsa is nonviolence. So we're trying to avoid being violent, because when we're violent towards others, sometimes it can be difficult to sit with ourselves. Steya, which is truthfulness. We want to avoid lying. When we are lying to ourselves or to others, it can also be hard to sit with ourselves. Asteya is non-stealing. We want to avoid stealing, and it's not just taking other people's things, but also taking other people's opportunities and taking other people's voices. It can be very difficult to sit with ourselves when we're taking from others things that don't belong to us. Brahmacharya, which is moderation. It is very difficult to sit too long with yourself if you are overdoing it in anything. If you're overeating, you're not going to feel too great. If you're oversleeping, you're not going to feel too great. It's kind of this recognition that, kind of like from Ecclesiastes and the song made, the section of Ecclesiastes made popular by the Byrds, to everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 and a time to every purpose under heaven. Then the last one is aparigraha, which is non-hoarding. Freedom from grasping. Basically, we're saying we don't need to hoard, take on things, and be so consumed with acquiring. When we become consumed with acquiring, we don't have as much time. We become consumed by the acquiring, and we miss out on the things that are really important. So that brings us to the Niyamas. And if you notice, all of these things are things that are in most of the major world religions. These are just basic ideas that most major religions agree on. And then the Niyamas, these are the things we are wanting to invite more of into our life. There's Saucha, which is cleanliness, which is important, but not just a clean body, a clean mind, a clean spirit. In, I think, Christianity is where they will say your body's a temple. Islam also has a tradition of cleanliness as well. So does Judaism with their the hygiene laws too. Then we've got Santosha, which is contentment, learning to be happy with what you have. I'm pretty sure most people in most religions have heard that one. Tapas, which is self-discipline. Another very popular thing that most world religions and philosophies agree is important. So, learning to focus yourself with positive change and to do what is good for you to grow instead of allowing yourself to maybe sit around watching TV and reality TV all day, eating chips and soda. And then there is Svadhyaya, which is self-study. Being aware of our own actions and taking time to grow and learn. So wisdom a lot of times not only comes from reading and learning and taking in information and ideas, but it's also thinking and reflecting on those ideas. If we just learn, we aren't acquiring wisdom because we're not reflecting. And the last one is Ishvara, which is surrender. And that is the idea that there is something beyond us. Whether, if you're a Christian, that's probably going to be the Trinity. If you're Jewish, that's going to be Adonai. If you are Islamic, then it might be Muhammad. But focusing your energy and recognizing that there is someone above you and that it's important to make room for faith. So those are the philosophical ideas that guide yoga as far as behavior goes. And as you can see, they're things that we all over the world hold in common for the most part. And now for a word about our sponsors. Today's sponsors are me and a Charlotte Mason Plenary. You can find out more about my advocacy work, working with parents and professionals to provide support for special needs families and children, and encouraging people to see children as people at amybodkin.com. Charlotte Mason Plenary is a homeschool company that supports children of all sorts of different types of needs with finding a curriculum that is a perfect fit for you and your family, doing it your way. Definitely check out the free 20 Principles study. It is fantastic. There are videos for Charlotte Mason's 20 Principles beginning with Children Are Born Persons, which is why she is my favorite educational philosopher. You can find out more about a Charlotte Mason Plenary and check out the 20 Principles study at cmplenary.com. So in a lot of ways, yoga is kind of like prayer, because prayer is a practice that people of all religions have, and even some of no religion. And it can be done by anybody, and the difference is who you're focusing that prayer towards, or where you're focusing that prayer towards. And it's the same way with yoga, because the practice itself involves things that people all over the world do. Avoiding violence, avoiding stealing, moving our bodies, trying to be aware of what our bodies need, what our minds need, trying to feed it in a balanced way that keeps us healthy. All of those are things that all of the world religions have promoted. It just depends on, what are you focusing on for your individual practice? And we have a saying in yoga, mind your own mat. It's the one rule that I have for parents when I teach family yoga. Because so many times when parents bring children into class, they're trying to get the kids to participate in the yoga. I'm like, just mind your own mat. Let them learn and take in what they're ready to. And when they're ready, they'll stay on their mat. And when they're ready, they'll do the poses. And if they're not ready, it's okay. I try to remember that when I take my kids to the grocery store. Always telling myself, Amy, mind your own mat. They will behave as they are ready to behave at this point. And they need the opportunity to learn where they're at in this moment without you stealing that opportunity from them. And that's okay. Which is really hard sometimes because in Western culture, especially, we have a tendency to feel like we need to train our children's behavior sometimes. And sometimes we want to push things. And really, we need to accept where they're at and let them take their next step, whatever that is. So, it's not exactly what most people think of in the West as far as what yoga is, but it can be a really great practice, especially if you're somebody who feels disconnected from your body. I used a program a couple years ago. It's called Project Mindful Movement, and the lady who created it was actually the private yoga teacher who used to come to my house. And she has little short programs that you can purchase individually, or you can purchase the entire program. And it was designed to be used in schools with teachers, but it's also been used by parents in homes with their children. Some of the things I really like that she offers is she has these little breathing exercises, and they're really short, but they're great for helping kids relax. And there's different ones, so different ones appeal to different people. My personal favorite is bee breath. And you stick your fingers in your ear, and I like to kind of flap my elbows up and down because then I feel like I have wings like a bee. And then you hum as you're holding your fingers over your ears and flapping your elbows. And it kind of makes this buzzing sound in your ears like a bee. And if you close your eyes, then it's kind of like you have this white noise going and you've cut out all the visual stimulation. And I find it very calming. That's my favorite breath of all of them that she's posted up there for kids. She also had some really great lessons on different character traits. Ones where she had little worksheets that made you really think about the particular character trait and how you see yourself as a person. The worksheets were kind of meditative in quality, and I thought those were really good for helping kids learn to reflect. Reflection can be really hard sometimes. And there's also a show on YouTube called Cosmic Kids Yoga. I love that one. The lady on there is very fun, and she's created a lot of really fun yoga practices. There's a Pokemon one, and she's got backgrounds, and she just makes it so fun. So I definitely like those. For adults, a lot of times I recommend Yoga by Adrienne. She's very popular, especially has become popular during the pandemic, but she's got a great website with lots of yoga videos. Some of them are only 20 minutes long. So that's pretty fantastic. Of course, the main point of doing yoga is meditation. Meditation is something that is also a practice like prayer that is practiced by pretty much all religions. It's mentioned in the Bible. It's definitely practiced in Catholicism with rosary praying. Liturgical prayers are meditative. Judaism has a strong practice of meditation in its history, especially at different points in time with different teachers. Yoga obviously has a strong tradition of meditation, and martial arts has a philosophy that guides that practice, and there's definitely a meditative mindfulness quality to martial arts as well, because you are focusing your body, mind, and soul all together into one single unit. So, my son prefers martial arts. I like yoga best because I find it's a little bit slower, especially if I can get a slower practice in. It helps to slow and settle my mind down more. But my son is still rather young, and he really likes the movement, and that tends to speak more to him. My daughter really likes yoga and meditation. But they're really good practices, and they're really good for helping kids to focus their minds. I think the thing is that a lot of times, if something doesn't connect with a parent, then the parents don't always want to encourage the child in whatever that is, because it just doesn't speak to the parent. But each person's unique, and they have to find what works for them. And what worked for me was doing yoga, because I needed a physical practice that would help me notice where I was out of balance, body, mind, and soul, and help me reconnect with myself as a whole person. The last thing that I'm going to share on this is that I find that it not only helps me connect to my own body, mind, and soul, and I also find that I enjoy a spiritual connection with it, that kind of goes along with my religious beliefs. But I also enjoy the connection it gives me, not just up and down, I guess. Earth to heaven, I guess, might be a way of putting that, but also the wideness of the connection, and that the common practice, much like when you participate in religious traditions and holidays and worship services, a lot of times you can feel connected to people all over the world, both near and far, and in your own time and in the past. And so in a lot of ways, yoga helps me connect not only with my own body, mind, and soul, but also with that of other people in the room, outside the room, in the past, in the present. And I think that's a very worthwhile thing, to practice those basic philosophical ideas of not harming, not stealing, being truthful. Those are all really important ideas to put out there into the world, and for us to practice together and learn to live better together, even when we're not necessarily all exactly the same. We don't all think the same. We don't all look the same. We don't all live the same kinds of lives. But we're all united as human beings, body, mind, and soul. We might be in different places. We might practice, live, believe, act very differently. But there are certain things we all have in common. And I find that to be particularly reassuring. Being autistic and so different, it's sometimes nice to realize that sometimes we may all act and look and learn different, but we're not all that different after all. It's been lovely chatting with you guys about one of my favorite topics, and I will see you guys next time.
We hope you had fun listening to today's episode and gained some new insights into the wonderful variety of people in our world. You can find out more about Amy's advocacy work at amybodkin.com. And remember, special needs kids are people too.